Hi, everyone. Welcome to another video. So today we're going to be looking at a video by Dr. Andrew Huberman, Professor Andrew Huberman, who interviewed an old friend of the channel called Dr. Chris Gardner. If you're not familiar with my previous videos on Gardner, I'll sort of get into it probably at the end. Let's start it and see what we have to say.
Human beings are, I presume, the same species, that some of us might thrive perhaps on one form of diet and others might thrive perhaps on a different form of diet.
So is there another species in the wild? I don't know, pick your species of choice, tigers, monkeys, whatever you want to pick, where some members of the species have one ideal diet and another member of the species have another ideal diet? I mean, maybe, but they would be geographically separated, and the two diets would be pretty damn close, right? So, for example, an Indian tiger might be eating a certain kind of deer, and I don't know, a Chinese tiger might be eating another kind of deer that doesn't exist in India, right? So, in other words, what I'm saying is his question presupposes that humans are different from other animal systems, and we don't have any evidence for that hypothesis, right?
In other words, how do we justify talking about the quote unquote best diet for a given age?
We justify talking about the best diet for a given species because there's always a species appropriate diet. That's just how evolution works, right? Evolution favors certain things. There's certain push and pull factors. There's usually massive die-offs with a remaining very small population that then has to repopulate, etc. That's sort of what happens. We call them evolutionary bottlenecks. And what happens is if you have the same species, if you're anatomically the same, more or less you're going to have the same diet. So as I say, if the animal is widespread enough, I gave the example of a tiger. You could talk about dogs as an animal that are far more widespread than even cats, right? So you have wild dogs in the Americas, you have wild dogs here in South Africa, and you have wild dogs even as far away as Australia. They all have kind of similar diets, right? They're all hunters. They all hunt similar looking prey, right?
Demographic, level of activity, etc. If one were to look at social media or even just the history of nutrition in this country, one can almost reflexively lean on the idea that maybe we all need something different and some experimentation and discovery is needed. So
I mean, the one thing that I will say is because humans are different from other animal systems in that we have culture. So, we have adopted different diets historically because of geographic spread and because of cultural differences, right? And also because of class differences and so on. I don't know if we're going to get into that in this video, but there are very few places in the world, historically speaking, where rich people eat the same food as poor people. And of course, the rich-poor distinction is something that came very, very late in human evolutionary history. So we're talking about 10,000 years ago. Humans are at least 350,000 years old.
Do we need different diets, or is there a best diet?
So there isn't one best diet, and I don't think
so. Yeah. So Dr. Chris Gardner, no surprise, is wrong. Like there's got to be I'm not saying I know what it is necessarily, but I wouldn't even describe it as the best diet. But there is a diet upon which humans evolved here in Southern Africa, where humans evolved, right? That exists, and by default, we must assume that diet, not necessarily the best, but the species appropriate, the safest diet, right? Best involves a value judgment, which I'm not comfortable making, but it is a species appropriate diet for humans, whatever humans were eating 100,000 years ago, like right here in Southern Africa where they evolved, right?
I think we need different diets. We're just incredibly resilient and we can do crazy wild things. So the way I start my human nutrition class at Berkeley with students is in the very first class, I point out the Tarahumara Indians, who are like world-class ultra marathon runners, mostly corn and beans, like total carb.
Yeah, and if you go to that community, I think I'm familiar with the community that he's talking about in the Americas, and I think what is today Mexico. You go and you talk with them and you ask about what their complaints are. They say they don't get as much meat as their ancestors used to get. That's their biggest complaint. And that's a result of industrial civilization and encroaching on their territory and so on, right?
And then you can look at the Alaskan Inuits, who for centuries lived on whale and blubber and polar bear and things like that. So that was like total fat and total carb. And they thrived. There's really no diabetes, no heart disease, no cancer. But eating all the...
I think if you looked a little bit deeper in maybe certainly in the carb diet, the fat diet is much closer to a species appropriate diet, right? But I think if you looked a little bit deeper and sort of did some analysis, I think you probably would find that certain levels were suboptimal. I think you'd find certain deficiencies and so on, right? Because humans didn't evolve on corn and beans. That much is very, very clear.
They're local, indigenous diets. Michael Pollan has a great quote on this, the author of Omnivore's Dilemma, and it says, if you really look around the world, it is amazing how much variety there is in a diet that people can thrive on, except the one that doesn't work is the American diet, the standard.
Yeah, I suppose we can agree on that. So the worst diet imaginable is something like what's becoming a standard processed food diet. I hesitate even to call it the SAD diet, the standard American diet, because it's like the standard South African diet. It's becoming the standard Indian diet, the standard Chinese diet. Like it's pretty much everywhere, and it's a lot of fats and carbs at the same time, and it's all protein deficient. So yeah, he's going to talk. I assume he's going to go into UPF, ultra processed foods, as the problem, but I don't think that's the only problem. I think that's one of several problems with that diet.
American diet, because it's full of processed packaged food. And the sad thing is that the Tarahumara Indians now eat a lot of crap. And the Alaskan people and the Inuits now have a lot of packaged processed food shipped in. And the world's all sort of...
So if you want to learn about packaged food being shipped into Arctic populations, check out the interview I did with Joseph Pitawanakwat. It's now a couple of years ago. Great guy. I'm trying to get him back on the channel. But he talks about how, children were getting diabetes by age 16, 17 because of all this packaged food coming into the Arctic regions.
Centering on an unhealthy diet that is convenient and it's inexpensive and it's available and it's addictively tasty and it's problematic. So no, there's not one best diet. It's incredible how resilient we are.
So I would challenge Chris or anyone else who believes this. Like, what is another species that has more than one best diet, or species appropriate diet would be more accurate? Give me the example of one other species in nature, like just one, right? Because if humans are the only one, that's a really weird thing to be saying, right?
So I'd love to get into that.
Great. Well, there's so many facets to what we call diet or nutrition. There's the macronutrients, protein, fats, and carbohydrates. The micronutrients, there's how many calories are in there. There's how it was sourced.
So there's no calories in food. Calories are heat. Calories are energy. A calorie is defined as the amount of heat needed to raise 1 degree of water, 1 degree centigrade at sea level. And you're not eating heat as far as I know, so let's not use that term, please.
There's how that sourcing impacts the environment. There are just so many lenses to look at this issue through. I would like to know, because of what you just told us, that people prior to food making its way around the world from different cultures to other cultures, food largely centered on what was grown and hunted and harvested locally.
Yep.
Is it possible that even though people have dispersed across the planet, sort of going back to this first question, that there is a quote unquote best diet, meaning not that we can adapt to any diet, but that for some of us, high meat, high fat, maybe even let's say high protein, high fiber, just to make it a little bit less extreme, high protein, high fiber, low starch is better. And for people that are descendants of people with genes from another part of the world, that high starch, high fiber, lower protein would be advisable.
So in order for this hypothesis to have any traction, you would need to find meaningful genetic differences between populations of humans. And the only one, when it came to absorbing and digesting food, and the only one that I'm aware of that's been studied is with certain Arctic populations. Basically, they have an adaptation that doesn't allow them to get into ketosis properly. There's all kinds of discussions about why that may be the case. But so that's one genotype. And actually, that would suggest the opposite of what he's saying, that maybe they need to eat more carbs. But this is a population that didn't have any carbs, right? So anyway, so we need to be very clear that there are no genetic differences, right? I'm very cautious about this because it's sort of going towards 19th century race theory, where like Africans have different dietary needs than Europeans, who have different dietary needs than Asians, and so on. That's different than cultural appropriateness. That's a different discussion. But genetically speaking, those three populations that I just mentioned are the same. There's no real difference when it comes to genes, right? Of course, individual genes are, a given individual has a unique genotype, but at the population level, there's no genetic differences between those things. In other words, the race theory of the 19th century is nonsense. And that's been very well understood for 100 years, maybe more.
For me, the best way to answer that is people come up to me quite often and say something like, Professor Gardner, I know you're all into whole food, plant-based diets, and I was vegan, I was vegetarian, I was trying that, and I had some health issues. And
No kidding, because it's a nutritionally destitute diet. It's not a diet that's species appropriate, right?
Switch to be more fat and more meat. And I'm almost embarrassed to be asking you this because my doctor told me I shouldn't do this either, but all my health issues have cleaned up.
Yeah, health issues clean up when you shift to something like a species appropriate diet. Go figure.
I'm looking really good. And I have a whole nother cadre of folks who are eating a lot of meat and a lot of fat. And they said, I went vegan, I went low fat vegan, and all my health issues cleaned up. And I'm not.
So I would challenge those folks. I listen. I've been in both of those shoes. I know the situation pretty well. I think the people who are saying I went vegan and everything cleared up were not on a low carb diet. They were not on a ketogenic diet. They were certainly not on a carnivore diet. They were on a standard diet that included lots of fat and lots of carbohydrate, which is going to trigger immune responses. Is going to trigger the Randle cycle. Is going to trigger issues, right? So we're not surprised when someone transitions to a low fat vegan diet that they see improvements because they've been screwing themselves up for an extended period of time. Now, that said, there are a couple of anecdotes that I can think of that I've seen on the net of people who went, they were doing keto and carnivore and they had some issues and they transitioned to vegan and that seemed to be working for them. But it's very, 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 very rare. So I don't think he has a whole cadre of people like that. There may be one or two. And I don't know, those people, it's very hard to give them feedback because I don't know how they were doing the carnivore diet. I don't know how they were doing, the many different kinds of carnivore diets. I don't know what they were doing. But some of them are doing things like the sugar diet, which is obviously a bad idea. So anyway, let's see where Gardner goes with this.
Much better now than I was before. And it's really hard to look someone in the eye who's doing something wildly different and say, well, you're wrong, you're lying. I mean, clearly these people were really probing for the diet that was best for them. And they were following some advice that they thought was good and they kept following it and it wasn't working. They tried something counter to that and it worked better. And they're trying to rationalize that and deal with that. So I am sure that there are different diets for different people.
How can you be sure of that? Like, how does it make any sense? So let me just caveat that by saying, I kind of believe the same thing, except I believe it in the context of sickness. In other words, if a human has been given a species appropriate diet since birth, which will be a hyper-carnivorous diet of 70 to 80% meat plus, right? Then I don't think, I don't think that person will get sick, and B, whatever sickness they have, they're going to overcome. And that is the ideal diet for that person. However, because we have all been on standard diets at various points in our life for extended periods of time, some of us have made the mistake of trying vegan and vegetarian diets as well. So we have become sick, and sickness manifests very differently in different people. So if you're a sick person, then I think there may be the case that there are different diets for different places in your progression. I think that's completely true. But at the sort of base level, that doesn't mean that there isn't a species appropriate diet for humans. Make sense?
But at the end of the day, it's just not the packaged processed food that the whole world is leaning towards.
I really appreciate that answer because as somebody who's tried various diets, I never had any serious health issues, thank goodness. But I know what I thrive on. I'm an omnivore. Not that people need to know this, but I like to eat meat, fish, chicken, eggs, lots of fruits and vegetables. I eat very little starch. I wouldn't say I'm low carb because I eat a lot of fruits and vegetables and some limited amounts of starch. But having tried many, many different things, including vegetarian diet, lacto vegetarian many years ago, and more extreme keto type diets that lean more heavily on meat as opposed to the way perhaps keto should be done, which we'll talk about. I've just found this works really well for me. So I fully embrace the idea that different people thrive on different diets. How is it that's true? Meaning, do you think this is because of genetic, our inheritance of genes from people that, came from different parts of the world? And to what extent can a different diet passed through generations have epigenetic effects? Maybe I thrive on that and somebody else thrives on something different because of where their ancestors are from and what they've been eating for the last maybe even 300 years. That's not long for an evolutionary event to take place, but some things can happen in 300.
I mean, you'd have to show me evidence of things happening in 300 years. Of course it can. I'm not saying it can't, but it can only happen in the context of a very severe bottleneck, right? So if we look, for example, there was a big bottleneck about 70,000 years ago in the human population where there was a volcano that went off on what is today Java, I believe, and it just, caused a sort of nuclear winter, and very, very few humans survived. I think about, 50 to 100,000, somewhere in that range, right? So in that context, if you sort of did a measurement before those 300 years and after those 300 years, there would be massive changes. But that's just because 90% of the population died, and the people who were left had a certain genotype, had a certain resilience to be able to survive in those environments. And therefore, for example, we know that those were coastal populations. The reason that humans seem to do so well with fish and even other things, mussels and so on, is because it seems like living next to the sea was a big part of surviving that particular event, right? I'm giving a very specific example, but my point is, for the last 300 years, there's been no event like that which would cause a massive die-off of humans. So in absent that context, these genetic shifts are unlikely, implausible, maybe even impossible.
Years.
So really the only classic example that's well established is lactose intolerance and lactase, and Northern Europeans developing the ability to continue making the enzyme lactase to break apart the molecule lactose.
Okay, so there's a couple things to say about this before he goes further. Number one is, it's not just Northern Europeans. People in my part of the world also have the enzyme to break down the lactase enzyme, the enzyme to break down lactose, number one. But number two, when we look at populations that actually include milk as a staple food, a lot of them do not have that gene, right? But they still get their nutrition from milk. So I'm thinking here of Mongolian populations. In Mongolia, milk is a hugely prized commodity. It's a hugely prized food, right? Everyone takes it. They make their liquor out of milk. Like, it's very, very serious. And they don't have the gene to do that, right? Number one. Number two is the Maasai populations here in East Africa and Southern East Africa, in Kenya, Tanzania. They also, if you're a Maasai warrior, you live for an extended period of time on just the blood and milk of cows. That's all you're eating. And it's kind of a mix of blood and milk that they make to make their staple food. Again, that is a population that does not have the lactase enzyme. So what does it tell us? It tells us that, yeah, there's some genetics are not your destiny. Your genes do not determine what food you're going to use. Culture is more important, in fact. Maybe there are things going on. First of all, there are things going on in those microbiomes. So if the humans can't digest it, maybe the bugs in our bodies can digest it. And then we eat the bugs and we eat the things that the bugs are letting off. Number one, that's a hypothesis. The other hypothesis is that culture just trumps these things. So there may be ways of eating, for example, mixing it with the blood. You may be doing something, you may be fermenting things. In Mongolia, of course, it is a lot of fermented camel's milk and goat's milk and all kinds of things, as well as fresh milk, right? So in other words, what I'm saying is, you can't be a genetic determinist about this. Just because someone doesn't possess or does possess a certain gene doesn't mean we can infer things about the diet.
Well into adult life. So the majority of the world is lactose intolerant. And if we could just do that for a minute. So when you're a newborn.
So when you say lactose intolerant, like, what do you mean exactly, right? Because I thought I was lactose intolerant because I would have a sip of milk and I would be literally doubled over in pain, accidentally have a sip of milk, and I would be in so much pain. I would not be able to bear it, right? And as I said, I haven't done my gene testing on this specific issue, but I come from a part of the world where dairy was a staple food and where we do have the enzyme, the gene, right? But I couldn't tolerate it for years and years and years. And now you see me, I'm having my milky coffee or whatever, like, it's no issue, right? Because I healed myself, I healed my gut. So I think taking, people can have symptoms. You can have the symptom of lactose intolerance and the genotype, or you can have the symptom of lactose intolerance and not the genotype. The symptoms are different than the genotype. And by the way, once you fix yourself, whether or not you're technically lactose intolerant, I think most of us can tolerate, dairy. It depends on the individual, depends how used you are to it. But I don't think the genotype is what is a determinant of whether or not you can digest that dairy.
Infant and you're having breast milk, you are getting lactose in your mom's milk. And then once you are weaned off the breast, most people in the world stop making lactase, that enzyme. And so I'm sure everybody listening to this knows someone who's lactose intolerant and either buys lactase milk or avoids milk.
So again, he's talking about symptoms. We cannot infer from the symptoms anything about the genes. It just doesn't make any sense. Genes are different, symptoms are different. I can guarantee you, we do a test of 100 people who claim to be lactose intolerant, and many of them will have the gene to digest the lactase enzyme, right? And we can do you can do a test of 100 people in Mongolia, you could do a test of 1 million people, and you find that none of them possess that gene, but they're all taking milk every day. So the inference that he's making is just not accurate. We cannot go from symptoms to genes.
Milk and avoids dairy because of the GI disorders. So it really is fascinating that some Northern Europeans at some point had enough cows and dairy and ate it that they developed the ability to keep making this enzyme.
Yeah, by the way, that's not the history of that's not the history of dairy production. Like, I wish this guy actually, he's a researcher, and I respect some of the research that he's done. I might talk about a study that I disagree with. Actually, I agree with the study, but he just doesn't learn his own lessons. I might talk about that study later in this video. I don't know, but dairy production started in East Africa, right? And it started, in my opinion, it started as a result to the fact of the fact that humans were losing their natural prey species due to the end of the last ice age. So in the last ice age, there were these large fatty animals going around, massive cows, massive elephants. We know that humans were hunting them from all kinds of evidence. The ice age ends, climate change happens, these animals go extinct, they're replaced by smaller, less fatty creatures. You need to find a way to replace those nutrients, either fat or carbohydrates. And in the case of East Africa, they found that dairy was a good source of saturated fat and could be used to replace the fat from the large animals that were no longer there, right? That's my hypothesis, my working hypothesis of how we ended up basically doing the agricultural revolution. But yeah, he doesn't seem to have considered this in much detail. He thinks it's a Northern European thing, and he is wrong.
Later in life, whereas the rest of the planet didn't. And it's not really hard, cut, and dry. So there's actually people who are lactose intolerant who can still tolerate some milk.
Okay, so he's admitted that it's not cut and dry. That's good to hear. And again, it's not just some milk. So use that Mongolian population. There's a population of people who don't have the gene and for whom milk is a staple food.
There's a lot of people who can't digest it. And to be honest, it doesn't really make much sense. If you look at mammals around the planet, all the mammals, right? Mammalian breast tissue, breast milk. So they're all drinking the mom's breast milk until they get weaned off for food. No other mammal on the planet drinks the breast milk of another mammal.
So I've given you the reason why that would be the case, right? Because again, humans lost the fatty animals upon which they were preying due to climate change, what happened at the end of the last ice age. And therefore, we needed ways to replace those nutrients. And milk was one way, one ingenious way of doing that.
To thrive later in life. So humans are the only ones who do it. It's really mostly cow milk. And it's kind of friggin' bizarre, but it works for a lot of people. And so that is the classic example of sort of overcoming genes over the course of evolution. But I don't know many like that. So I don't have a better example of, can people who evolved from Africans versus Asians versus Scandinavians do anything different than that? That's the only example I've got, but could be possible.
This is a part of a very, very long video. Let me know if you want further reaction vids on this video. Let me know down below. Number two is Gardner is someone who is an ideologue, right? He is someone who believes that vegan and vegetarian diets are good for the environment. He's gone on record saying this. And therefore, he wants people to become vegan and vegetarian. He has done tests. He's done a test back in 2009, which basically proves that the Atkins-style diet is as good or better as any other diet. The metrics on that, which I can put on the screen here, show that it's actually better than any vegan or vegetarian diet, right? So that's my issue with him in general. In this particular case, for this particular video, the hypothesis, it's important to understand, because when you listen to scientists talk, they are so stuck in their own assumptions. And of course, the clever people, but they're so stuck in their own assumptions that you don't understand that those assumptions have to be challenged, right? Often. So in this case, there's an assumption that because humans, as we know them, like over the past 200 or 300 years of studying, the anthropology as a profession has only been around for a couple hundred years, right? So we've only been studying humans for a couple hundred years in a sort of meaningful way. And when we started doing that, humans were in every continent except for Antarctica, and they had different diets even within continents. The diet in Egypt is very different than the diet here in South Africa, right? So the assumption is that's natural. That's how humans should be, or something like that, right? But the question that is unanswered is, well, how can that be the case when we know that every other species on the planet has a species-specific, species-appropriate diet, right? So once you understand that this contradiction exists, once you understand that his starting point is an assumption, then we can begin to, we can begin to understand a counter view. The counter view being that no, there is a species specific diet. And if that's the case, A, what would that diet be? I think that's a pretty easy question to answer. But B, why is it the case that different people seem to do better on different diets for short periods of time, et cetera, right? So these are questions that need to be explored and drawn out. And in my practice, we find that there's far less variation than people think. But yeah, I mean, for someone who's coming at this with a very, very strong vegetarian bias, that is probably the only conclusion you can make, that there are actually different diets for different genotypes, which in my opinion is completely ludicrous. But thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one.